AN hose assembly doesn't have to be difficult. It's not easy all the time, but when you follow some really simple rules, it can make the process so much easier. So let's take a look. This video is only going to concentrate on braided steel or this black Pro Classic from Russell. We're not going to talk about the twist lock stuff. We already covered that in another video. We're not going to talk about PTFE style hose. That will cover that in a separate video because that's its own animal. So we're just going to talk about how to assemble these braided style AN fittings. Or sometimes they get a little bit of a knock because they're a little bit more. People view them as complicated, difficult to assemble, and they're really not. So the biggest obstacle we're going to talk about first, and that's cutting the hose. Cutting the hose isn't that difficult, but there's some things that you can't use, and there's some things that are a little bit better, and there's some best practices on how to do it. So we'll talk about all that real quick. Let's just get rid of the garbage really quick first. I've seen people say they can use a set of these shears. You definitely can't. There's no way. We use this style to cut the twist lock style hose because it does a very good job. Nice and straight, goes through easy. But it will not cut braided line, and it's okay if you're using like that Russell Pro Classic or Pro Classic 2 hose. It does okay on that, so you can use it on that. But on the braided, which we're just kind of really going to concentrate on today because that's the hardest kind of hose to cut, absolutely can't use that. Now we're getting into stuff that's a little bit more sophisticated and one that's a little bit easy. Now, a hacksaw isn't bad. You've got to use a really fine tooth blade. I can't remember the tooth count on that. I'll leave that on the screen up here so you can see it. I think it's 32. I can't remember. But anyway, just a really fine blade. Hacksaw doesn't work bad. I don't prefer it. There's better ways to do it. Now you start getting into the more complicated stuff. You can buy, or if you've got access to a really nice set of Beverly shears, great. They're awesome. That's probably the best tool out of everything, but the home DIYer typically doesn't have that, $1,000 tool in their garage. These are pretty easy to get a hold of. Last two are pretty much my favorite. So, outside of the hacksaw, which is probably 2A, this would be 2B. This is the wrong size. You want one with a little bit bigger blade on it. This is a 3-inch cutting disc. You can use this style, but typically I like a 5-inch. It's a little bit easier to get a straighter cut. That's a big deal when you're talking about this. If you've got a chop saw, I've seen people use that before. I've used it, certainly. That works really well because the RPM stays up. It cuts through fairly quickly and easily. The only issue that I have with using a cutoff wheel in this is it's very, very dirty. You're going to have to clean the hose out very well, and you're going to have to do that, all of it, but certainly there's more gunk and garbage. And if you're talking about an EFI setup where you're talking about fuel injectors that are a little sensitive to debris in the system, this isn't my favorite to use on that. It can be done, but it's a little bit more complicated, I guess, if you don't have a cutoff wheel or a chop saw and you're a little unsure about it. This tool here is probably the easiest. Now, that's a standard cable style cutter. I've used this type for quite a long time. It's probably my favorite because it does a very nice clean cut. There is some downside to that as well. It does tend to pinch the line a little bit, but it works really good on the stainless steel braided or the regular nylon cloth type braided stuff that's on the, like I say, the Pro Classic hose. So that's easily my favorite. So this is 1, this is 2A and 2B. I could take my pick between either one. If I had to have it, I would, it's either or on that one. So let's take a look at how these three cut, because I think it's a little, because I think you'll see a little bit of a difference between all of them, and they are certainly different. Now, also, when you're talking about hose, you'll get some argument on this, and I typically will use a painter's tape. Why? Because it doesn't stick really aggressively to the material. When you're talking about the nylon braided hose, it will fray pretty easily when you take the tape off, and you're going to have to take it off at some point to assemble it into the hose socket. So the painter's tape doesn't stick as aggressively. Electrical tape does really, really well. I like that, but again, If you're using it on stainless, you're probably okay. If you're using it on that nylon, not so much. And last but not least, the old standard duct tape. Doesn't matter what color it's in. This is too aggressive. If you're cutting stainless, it's okay. The only problem that I have with cutting it on stainless is it will tend to pull up the cut once you've made it. So you've got to be a little bit careful. That's why I like something that's not as sticky. It will keep it from fraying, but it's delicate and it will come off easy and you don't typically run into issues. Biggest key to all of this, I don't care what type you're using, use your safety protection. Safety glasses at a minimum. If you're going to use gloves, that's fine, doesn't really matter. But don't monkey around with it. Even with the shears, certainly with the cutoff wheel, even the hacksaw, if you're going to use that, all of those will tend to fray little pieces of end that are on there, or if it does, they tend to fly off out of there. And trust me, you do not want to go to an emergency room with that small of material in your eye. It's not a fun day. I had a buddy that had that done, and it was pretty ugly and just creeps me out. So don't skip on it. Use your safety glasses for everything when you're talking about cutting this. So let's go ahead and cut some samples with each of those three, and I'll show you what it looks like. Here are the results of all the cuts. Now I used just the painter's tape on the shears. I didn't use it on the others. I don't have that much hose to destroy here today, so I'm a little limited, or I would have shown you that as well. But let's take a look at it, because that should stop the fraying the best. The electrical tape, it's a little bit more aggressive, a little stronger. The worst result out of these three was the cutoff wheel. Now, again, I am using the wrong size wheel here. It is a 3-inch. We definitely want to use a little bit bigger wheel. It just helps control it. The whole idea behind this is two things. Keep the cut as straight as possible and keep the fraying down to an absolute minimum. That's the two things you're looking for the most here. And the cutoff wheel in this instance, because I used the wrong size wheel, came out worse. And you can see this. We just cut it without having the any wrapping on it. This was another cut earlier. That was without it. You can see all the frayed ends on there. We'll talk about that in a minute. And here is one that the cut is nice. It's straight. The hose didn't get distorted at all. But the fraying is ridiculous. And if we pull this off of here, it's going to fray possibly a little bit more. So anyway, it's just not the best. Again, that's why I said you right tool for the right job, and that one's certainly the wrong one. So out of these three, that one was the worst. Hacksaw, not bad. Here's the cut we made with it unprotected, unwrapped, and it's not bad. It's frayed. It's certainly not the best. But again, we'll talk about that in a quick minute here with a different tool, but not bad. When it comes down to the wrap, I think it's a little bit better. There's not near as much fraying on this one. Get the material off here. See how it did. And again, that's not a bad cut. It's straight enough that it's going to fit into the hose socket okay. It's got a little bit of fraying occurring here, which I don't like, but if you're going to pick a second place winner, the hacksaw wins. Now, lastly, here's the shears. Now, the shears, again, have a little bit of a downside to it, and you can see where it pinched the hose down. Not that big of a deal. All you need to do is reshape it. It doesn't fray it, and this one is certainly the best. It doesn't have really any big major ones. We got a tiny one there starting to separate, but that is a good, clean cut that will allow you to assemble it pretty easily. Same here on the wrap side. It did a very good job. Let's peel this off of here and see. That's what I want to see. Very, very nice straight cut. Not a lot of fraying on it, and easy to assemble. These are bad samples really, because you're never typically going to make a hose that's that short. Once you start stacking hose ends onto it here, you see you're going to have a fairly short length of hose. So typically when you're cutting hose, you're working with longer pieces, 6 inches or longer typically, and you can kind of keep it a little bit straighter. So some of these are a little crooked. That's not the fault of The cutting tool, that was a fault of just having a short sample. But again, I don't have a lot to show or a lot to destroy here today. So anyway, that's the 3 results between the 3. Again, potentially will get better if we had a bigger cutoff wheel, and hacksaw not bad, but the shears for sure are my favorite. Before we get to the assembly side, let me just show you how this works so we understand what we're doing. I cut apart some -10 ones here so you can kind of see it. Actually, that's -12. So you can see a little bit more of how this works. So what happens is you've got 2 different pieces to it. You've got the hose end, you've got the socket. What happens is what we're going to do is we're going to drive the socket to the end of the hose, making sure that it's flush on there as best we can. That's how it'll help seal it up. And what happens is this end of the hose end is where we're going to drive through the socket to help it seal up. That tapered end there goes into the end of the hose, and as we continue to tighten down on it, it will pull further into the hose. These will come together and form the hose end. There's a couple of things to be careful of here. You can kind of see how that will, as the hose gets pulled down through there, again, with the socket, you're trying to get the end of the hose right towards the end of this little step here. That's the last piece in it. That's why it needs to be straight, because you want the hose all the way down onto that end of the socket, and that's what will help seal it up. And as you drive it, this hose end goes up into the hose. It's going to expand out quite a bit, or push the hose out quite a bit. It will catch on these barbs and it'll hold together. Now you're going to have to check the specs on the line, because honestly it's different for everyone, but typically that style stainless hose will hold a lot more pressure. That's why I like to use it a lot of times on transmission lines. That type of hose and a steel type of end we use for power steering, things of that nature. But the hose matches the application, so you have to be a little bit careful. But I just want to show you how that all works, how it all go together, and gave me a excuse to cut up some fittings that I didn't need. But yeah, anyway, that just screws up in there, and as it screws in, it tightens down and makes a more positive seal on it. Now, one other little thing here too, we'll talk about how far down that socket needs to go onto the hose end. For this type of hose end, the best thing to do is get a feeler gauge, and what we're going to measure is the distance that we have between the socket and the hose end up against that nut. Here's 2 examples here. This one here is the one that's I cut and assembled. This feeler gauge does not fit in there. Now this is 3/100ths is what we're looking for. Anything less than that. This one I opened up quite a bit. You can see how big that gap is in there. Feeler gauge fits in there. You certainly don't want that. Why is that important? Well, a couple of things. One, we're trying to get the hose end and the socket as close to down to tight as possible, because that will ensure the best seal on the hose on the inside. The other side of that is, again, if it's not completely assembled, you could run into the hose pulling out of the hose end, and again, that would be another bad thing. Leaks is what we're trying to prevent here. So for that type of hose end, I'm pretty confident that you could say that 3/100ths is probably where you need to be. So good feeler gauge, just verify where you're at and mind the gaps on there when you're done with it. Here's the part where all the 4-letter words come into play, and this is where you don't need to. If you made the right cut, this is going to be very, very simple. So what we need to do first is we need to get the hose end, or the socket, that's the hose end, this is the socket, onto the end of the hose. Now, if it's frayed really wild, like some of these that we cut, it is practically impossible to get this hose end on here. You could clamp this down in a vise, we'll show you that in just a second, and try to push all these in there, but that's time that I don't have. I don't want to be monkeying around with that for 5 or 6 hours trying to get one socket onto a hose. If you've cut this straight and good, this just slides right on. Just like that. Twist it a little bit, watch in there, make sure that you get it all the way in, and once you're satisfied that it's all the way down, you're good to go. Now here's where the wrenches come into play. You can use a AN wrench and just kind of turn that a little bit, make sure it's down. But once we know it's completely seated, and that is all the way seated down there, which means the hose is cut straight and flat, it's straight on the socket, now we're ready to assemble. Before we put the hose end in here, it's a good idea to make sure that we know that that hose hasn't slipped out of there. And the easiest way to do that is just add a little bit of tape to it. Now, some folks will use a black magic marker or a silver magic marker or something like that. I tend not to do that just because I don't want to screw up the aesthetics of the hose and leave a black marker mark on there. So do whatever you'd like. I mean, I'm not opposed to it, but all we're trying to do here is just find a way to mark it so we know that that hose didn't slip out of there when we were doing it. So that's all we're going to do, is we're going to use that as a reference mark. It's butted right up against to where that socket needs to be. Now we can mount this into the vise, and I'll show you how to tighten that down. We've got everything set here. One other little tool I want to show you. These are clamps that we'll use, or vise. These are made out of aluminum. This is a 6061 material, if I remember correctly. They're magnetic, so they will stick to your vise, and what it's designed to do is it just helps not to mar up the aluminum fitting. Even though the fittings are the same material, you don't want to put it into a steel vise and clamp it in there. So if, again, just for the aesthetic side of it, we're just talking about making sure that we don't screw that up. So hose end with our hose, we will put it right underneath here, because all we're going to do is ask this to hold this down while we do some heavy work here. Okay, just snug it up. Now, we've got good control or handle on the hose underneath, so we can kind of make sure that it's not twisting as the hose end is going in there. Another last little detail is always lubricate these threads. Do it on the socket and do it on the hose end. Now, I just use a regular 3-in-1 oil. You don't have to use anything complicated. There's plenty of product out there that is assembly lube for AN fittings. It's just 3-in-1 oil. Don't spend a ridiculous amount of money on that kind of stuff. So we're just going to put a little bit of oil on there and a little tiny bit on the inside, and that's all we need. Just make sure to keep the threads lubricated. Now, all we're going to do is start to tighten that down in there. Here's where you have to be a little careful, because as you're trying to fit that tapered end into the hose, you want to be careful that you're not pushing the hose out the bottom. Again, the reason why we marked it. So as we do that, we're going to grab a hold of the hose. We're going to start to push that down in there, and then we can take the wrench and tighten that down while we're maintaining control of the hose, and then we can watch it as we're screwing it down and make sure we're not pushing the hose out the bottom. All we're going to do, slowly start tightening that down. We're going to need our feeler gauge here in a minute. I don't have any tension on the hose, which is good. We're getting down in there. It's going in nice and easy, again, because we lubricated that. So no issue there. We're starting to get a little tighter with it, and it's starting to get a little aggressive on the tight. Let's get a wrench on there. And again, we're just making sure that the hose on the other side isn't twisting out of there. And everything feels good. And we are snug. Now we can take it out of the vise. And let's get our feeler gauge. And let's see how we did. We don't need the feeler gauge. That nut from the hose end is directly on the socket. Now, let's take a look at the tape and make sure we didn't push out of there. We are looking good. I don't see any silver in there. We are in good shape. So, that means that that hose end is assembled correctly. The hose is up against the end of the socket. The hose end got secured all the way down in there. That is ready to go, installed, good to go. And that is one assembled hose end. The more of these you do, the quicker you'll get at it. It's really getting the cut straight, and then everything else is really simple beyond that. Goes together easy. If it ever starts to push the hose out of the socket as you are tightening it up, you need to stop and start over. So back the hose end completely back out. It'll release out of the hose, and then just reseat it back into the socket, and you should be good to go. But that the vise helps keep the end nice and tight and in there without marring it up. You could do this without the vise, and sometimes folks will use just a adjustable end wrench to hold the nut and do this in the driveway, whatever, and tighten it down with the size A end wrench it is. You can do that. I prefer to do this a little bit better because you're not holding onto this, you're holding onto the hose as you're tightening that down. You can just make sure that the hose isn't twisting or pushing out of the socket if you just take a good hold of it right there. So having the vise is a pretty nice deal. It's not that much money to buy those, and it just helps you put a better assembly together. So now that we've done one the right way with an easy, let's take a look at the frayed end on one of those, and maybe I'll fray the end of this one so we can try it a different way. Here's a really frayed end on the other end of that line. Ugly. Now, if you have a frayed end that bad, this is where the 4-letter words start, and nobody has any fun assembling this. But I have had a little luck with a different tool. This one is really aggressive. I don't know that we're going to be able to do that because that's a lot of braided material that is folded over, and it's just too far gone, I think. But if it was a little less aggressive, we can see. Let's put this one to the test. There is a tool called Cool Tool. You can find it on online. I'll leave some links down below. All that does is help you get the socket end onto the end of the hose. As it sits right now, there's no way in God's green earth you're going to get that on there. It's just frayed too badly. I'm not sure we're going to be able to do it with the tool, but we're going to try it out. So here's how that tool works. We're going to take the socket end, put it in there. Hose is going to slide in this way. Hopefully it's tapered to get it or get the frayed ends down in there, and supposedly do that. You get some washers to shore this up because you don't want this thing moving around in here. This is a -6 hose. I've used it plenty of times, so I know I need all the little washers that I have. Now that's in there nice and tight. It's not going to come out of there. All you do is clamp that shut, and you've got a straight shot down in there that's tapered to hopefully allow that in there. All we're going to do is we're going to clamp this down into the vise, try to shove it in there. So let's move right back over the vise and see if we'll have any luck with that horribly frayed end. We have our tool loaded, socket end in there. Like I said, just get a clamp down here in the vise. Don't have to get too aggressive. That tool is pretty tough, but you're going to need to make sure it doesn't move. So it needs to be in there good. And all we're going to try to do is see if we can cram that in there. Now, I'm not going to give it much help. I'm just going to see how bad that works going in there. So let's see if we can get that in the tool. Ugh. Wow. Okay. You can tell two things. I don't know if you can see that over here, but I've got some wiggle room in there, which tells me that the frayed ends are keeping it from seating all the way up against there. That's a problem. You want the hose to be completed up against or sealed up against that socket end. Let's get that out of there and see if we can see what the problem is. Let's see what we got going on here. So take that apart. Yeah, so it didn't even seat in there. I'm going to have to get a little bit more aggressive with it. Off camera, I did a little bit more swearing to see if I could get that on there. And I started to get it to roll into there, but would I trust it? Nah, probably not. I think what it would do is just roll that, that frayed bit over like it started to do here. I got part of it to go in, which wouldn't be bad. You'd still seal it up against there, but again, I just don't know that I would trust it. So I went ahead and cut it off with a hacksaw. It's got a little bit of a, fray to start to it. So let's see how well we can get that in there. We got that in there nice and flush. So, yeah, it's seated up against there. It just takes a little bit more aggression to get it in there. But, yeah, I'm not upset with that. And then same thing. Wrap it, clamp it down in the vise, put the hose end in, oil it up, and tighten her down, and she'll be another good fitting on that end. Slightly frayed, not near as bad as what we started with, but yeah, maybe that's just the limitations of the tool, or maybe I just didn't elephant man that thing in there strong enough. So hard to say, but yeah, we're good to go. Just remember those really basic tips. Get a really good cut on it. Keep the fraying down to as minimum as possible. Make sure you get a good straight end on there. Make sure when the hose is going into the socket that you get a good tight seal up against the end of that. And then when you're tightening it down, just make sure that that hose isn't backing out of there, and you'll be good to go. This isn't very complicated. Doesn't require a lot of specialty tools. Yes, a good set of AN wrenches I consider absolutely necessary if you don't want to mar up the look of your fittings, and certainly the good vise. The cool tool is kind of nice. It's not that expensive, really, if you want to give that a try. But really, with those a little bit more advanced tools where you talk about the cable cutters, yeah, it can get a little bit weird, but all those tools together, it's really not that much money, and you're going to reuse those over and over again anyway. Just don't be afraid of it. The AN assembly is not that difficult. It just takes, again, the right tool and then following the right best practices, and you'll be good to go. And certainly underhood will look a lot nicer if you can route these, make these to the length that you want, and not have a universal type of ends and links and all that stuff, and make your fuel system on it, transmission line, power steering line, oil cooler lines. All of these are fairly simple. A little bit different fittings and hose ends and hose, but the process is pretty close to the same. Again, we'll cover PTFE in a different video. That's a little bit different animal with how that goes together, but a lot of these are going to be a little bit of the same. So if you have any questions on this one, don't hesitate, leave them down below. I'll leave some links to some of these items down into the comments or the video's description down there. And yeah, I guess we'll catch you guys on the next one. We'll see you.